Wyoming, 1886. A harsh territory where the howling gales show no mercy and the blazing sun silently watches the brutality of mankind. Folks often claim that wealth cannot purchase survival. Yet out in the American West, cash acquired timber, secured coal, and provided a false sense of safety. That was until the arrival of a winter so fierce it could have frozen hell itself. What follows is the tale of how the valley's wealthiest barons, equipped with their heavy iron stoves, shipped from Chicago and wrapped in thick buffalo coats, ended up shivering in absolute terror. It is also the chronicle of Mateo, a 17-year-old kid who arrived empty-handed, bearing sun-baked, earth-toned skin, who managed to erect an impenetrable fortress against the Reaper using the very things society discarded: debris and rocks. If anyone has ever dismissed your visions simply because you lack a prestigious family name or a hefty bank account, keep listening. Because this narrative was written precisely for you. Mateo wandered into the Green River Valley during the summer of '86. He didn't own a steed, nor did he possess a fresh pair of boots. His sole possession was the memory of his old man, a stonemason from Zacatecas, who perished laying down railroad ties across these very plains. The youngster staked a claim on a plot that seemed like a vicious joke, a jagged south-facing hillside crawling with rattlesnakes and littered with dark volcanic boulders that nobody else desired since they were useless for plowing. The local financier, Mr. Silas Thorne, chuckled as he watched the boy sign the deed with a shaky X. Thorne was the kind of individual who evaluated the entire universe in greenbacks. He owned the tallest residence in town, a towering Victorian structure boasting massive north-facing windows, daring Mother Nature with the hubris of someone who trusts his wallet to act as an impenetrable shield. "Son," Thorne muttered, lighting up a cigar that was worth more than the boy's entire outfit. "That patch of dirt is nothing but a graveyard of stones. You won't grow any wheat, and cattle sure won't graze up there. You'll starve to death long before Christmas rolls around, assuming the frostbite doesn't take you first." The teenager pulled off his battered hat. He locked eyes with the wealthy man and replied in broken yet unwavering English, "I ain't gonna plant wheat, mister. I'm gonna harvest heat." Thorne let out a booming laugh that echoed all the way through the general store. A few other ranchers standing nearby, rugged fellas who put their faith strictly in brute strength, joined in the mockery. To that crowd, the kid was just another unfortunate fool bound to be buried alive under the incoming snowdrifts. However, the young man harbored a specific strategy. It wasn't a blueprint you'd find in the fancy engineering manuals from the East Coast, but rather wisdom passed down through the ancient memories of his ancestors. As his affluent neighbors went about raising massive barns and homes framed with flimsy green pine boards, the boy started scavenging exactly what they tossed away. He headed out to the dump situated behind the saloon. There, he gathered up discarded whiskey jugs and empty medicine vials. He found hundreds of them, in shades of green, brown, and clear glass. Then he hiked down to the riverbank to haul up, one after another, the heavy, dark volcanic rocks that supposedly rendered his property worthless. The foreman from the adjacent spread, a burly fellow known as Bill the Hammer, rode past one afternoon and spotted the kid stacking those dark boulders against the southern slope of his dugout. "What exactly are you doing, boy?" Bill hollered. "Digging yourself a grave?" "I'm setting up a trap, sir," the teenager replied, wiping the perspiration off his brow with his sleeve. "A bear trap?" "Nope, a trap to catch the sun." Bill spat a wad of tobacco onto the dirt and shook his head in disbelief. "You're completely out of your mind. Once that northern gale hits, those rocks are going to be as freezing as a wicked woman's heart. Go buy some lumber, you idiot, and act like a real man." Yet the boy didn't purchase any timber. He lacked the funds to do so. His so-called madness set him back exactly $4, spent entirely on lime and clay. Every other part of the project was paid for in pure elbow grease. Mateo erected a thick barrier, roughly 1.5 feet wide, crafted completely out of those dense, dark stones. Nevertheless, he didn't leave the masonry exposed to the open breeze. Right here lay the hidden secret, the clever trick those gringos entirely overlooked. Just a couple of inches in front of the stone face, he molded a secondary partition utilizing mud mixed with all those scavenged glass bottles, snugly nested together. This arrangement formed a pocket of air resting right between the glass surface and the dark rock. Anybody who has ever rested a hand on a black boulder during the midday summer heat knows it scorches the skin. Dark materials naturally soak up the sunlight. Meanwhile, glass captures the warmth and prevents it from bleeding away. Mateo was constructing a massive thermal battery. Throughout the daylight hours, the low-hanging winter sun would strike the bottles, heat up that trapped pocket of air, and basically bake the stones behind it. Later, during the pitch-black night, right as outside temperatures plummeted to lethal lows, those tons of heated rock would slowly radiate their stored warmth inward, directly into the small dugout cabin nestled behind the barrier. It was fundamental physics in action. It was generations of inherited wisdom. Best of all, it didn't cost a dime. October eventually rolled around. Along with the new month came the initial icy breath of an approaching monster. While the autumn of '86 felt deceptively mild, the local wildlife sensed what was brewing over the horizon. The timber wolves sported coats thicker than any old-timer could recall. Down by the creek, beavers were busy constructing dams twice as deep as usual. Over at the Thorne estate, a brand-new steam central heating system was just being installed. It was considered an absolute modern marvel. A network of pipes hissed and clanked, delivering warmth to every single room in the manor. The whole setup carried a price tag of $1,000. Thorne proudly boasted after Sunday service that he had successfully tamed the winter. Down at the kids' dugout, there wasn't a pipe in sight. He had 0 coal stockpiled. There was merely a barrier of dark rock that felt pleasantly warm against the palm right as dusk settled, much like the flank of a resting horse. The townsfolk would gaze up at the meager shack with a deep sense of pity. That poor youngster, the local church ladies would whisper. We ought to pray for his soul. They'll surely uncover his frozen corpse come springtime. Then, unexpectedly, the skies shifted. On January 28, 1887, the daylight completely vanished. A heavy, lead-colored curtain descended straight out of Canada. The gales started to scream with a tone that almost sounded human, packed with agony and pure rage. The thermometer simply nosedived. It plunged from a brisk 40 degrees Fahrenheit all the way down to 4 below zero in barely 3 hours. Back at the banker's mansion, that cutting-edge boiler devoured coal like a starving beast. Nevertheless, the frigid gusts managed to seek out every tiny gap around those elegant Victorian window frames. The single-pane glass, lacking any real insulation, allowed the indoor heat to bleed out into the storm almost as swiftly as the furnace could generate it. Over at the foreman's place, the freshly cut green firewood just hissed, stubbornly refusing to catch a proper flame. Thick smoke blanketed the living room, causing Bill's children to hack and cough, all while the freezing draft seeped upwards through the floorboards raised on wooden stilts. Meanwhile, up on that rocky hillside, Mateo sat quietly. Outdoors, the blizzard roared at 60 miles an hour. Yet securely inside his shelter, protected by the dark stone and glass partition, the temperature hovered comfortably around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. He rested his palm flat against the rocks. They were delightfully hot. The masonry had been soaking up rays for 3 solid days before the blizzard hit. And now, acting like a nurturing mother, it generously radiated all that warmth back into the gloom. He hadn't spent a single penny on fuel. He hadn't chopped down a solitary pine. Mateo enjoyed a steaming bowl of pinto beans, glanced down toward the valley where the wealthy estates flickered weakly in the storm, and got ready to catch some shut-eye. Little did he know that down in the flats, vanity was on the verge of turning to solid ice. And very soon, those exact individuals who had labeled him insane would be forced to choose between their stubborn pride and their very survival. What unfolded over the next 72 hours across the Wyoming territory wasn't merely a blizzard, it was an all-out siege. Scholars nowadays refer to it as the Great Die-Up, though the cattlemen who actually lived through it gave it a much blunter title: the White Death. The wind didn't just blow. It shrieked, a relentless, maddening howl that completely wiped out a man's ability to think straight. The snow wasn't drifting down from the clouds. It fired horizontally like frozen shrapnel, probing for any crack, every keyhole, and every single flaw in the armor of human architecture. And the storm discovered plenty of weak spots. Inside the Victorian manor belonging to Silas Thorne, modern hubris collided violently with the harsh laws of thermodynamics. The banker had placed his absolute faith in his fancy central heating, a mechanical wonder of steam and copper piping, promising to drag civilized living straight into the untamed frontier. Yet the wealthy man had neglected a fundamental rule: overly complicated systems are the worst enemies of basic survival. By the second night of the whiteout, ambient temperatures plummeted to 30 below zero Fahrenheit. The liquid moving through the mansion's pipework, particularly the exposed sections winding through the poorly insulated cellar, ceased circulating. It just stopped dead. And, as any fool knows, freezing water swells up. Right around 3 in the morning, a noise resembling a cannon blast jolted the Thorne household awake. Crack! A main line ruptured violently in the kitchen. Then a second one burst down the hallway. Scalding steam violently vented out with a fatal hiss, flooding the residence with moisture that transformed into frost in a matter of minutes. Expensive Persian rugs, imported all the way from New York at an outrageous premium, turned into stiff, crunchy skating rinks. The boiler unit, now starved of proper circulation, started to overheat to a dangerous degree, forcing Thorne to manually shut the whole rig down with shaking fingers. In the blink of an eye, the most technologically advanced estate in the entire county morphed into an icy tomb. Left with a dead heating system, the desperate banker tried firing up the ornamental fireplaces. However, those hearths were built purely for aesthetics, not for throwing out practical warmth. They were incredibly shallow. The gales, mercilessly battering the northern facade, generated a powerful vacuum effect that sucked all the soot directly back into the parlor. The most affluent family in the region found themselves hacking, their eyes streaming with tears, huddled tightly together in a single room wrapped in sable furs, watching their own breath form frosty white clouds inside their living quarters. Thorne stared blankly at his fine mahogany furnishings. He glanced over at the grand piano, and for the very first time in his existence, he didn't perceive them as markers of high society. He simply saw extremely expensive firewood. "Toss the chairs in the fire," he commanded with a cracking voice. "Burn every last piece of it." Barely 2 miles down the road at Bill the Hammer's homestead, circumstances were distinct, yet equally grim. The foreman didn't boast any fancy plumbing. He owned a timber-framed cabin, slapped together with the hasty overconfidence of a muscular guy. He put his trust squarely in cut logs. There was a massive woodpile stacked out back inside his barn. Nevertheless, Bill had made the classic blunder of the overly proud. He underestimated his adversary. The whiteout was so vicious that merely trekking the 50 yards from the back porch to the woodshed equated to a literal death sentence. Visibility was absolutely zero. The gusts slammed against the walls with enough force to knock a full-grown adult flat on his back. The burly foreman attempted a supply run on that first morning. He secured a rope around his waist, tying the other end to the doorknob. But the bitter frost clamped his eyelashes shut in mere seconds. The atmosphere was so punishingly cold that taking a breath felt like inhaling liquid fire straight into the lungs. He was forced to retreat, completely beaten, clutching a measly 3 pieces of split wood under his arm. His residence, framed entirely with uncured timber that had shrunk over time, acted like a giant sieve. Freezing draughts whistled freely through the gaps between the clapboards. Tallow candles sputtered wildly before winking out. His youngsters sobbed miserably beneath heavy quilts. The youngest boy, barely 6 years old, had stopped shivering altogether. And as any seasoned frontiersman will tell you, that right there is the absolute final warning sign before the eternal slumber takes hold. The quiet onset of extreme hypothermia. The big man stared helplessly at his interior walls, flimsy partitions, boundaries that failed to keep a single thing out. He angrily cursed his own bulging muscles. He swore violently at his trusty felling axe. Above all, he cursed the very afternoon he stood there and mocked the Mexican kid for stacking dark rocks. Meanwhile, up on that despised rocky hillside, time itself seemed to have frozen in place. Mateo was resting on the hard-packed dirt floor of his small, half-buried dugout. He didn't own any heavy fur coats. He wore an old woolen serape over a patched-up flannel shirt. Right across from him, that barrier of dark rocks was giving off a steady, almost miraculous warmth. Throughout the days leading up to the blizzard, the low-hanging winter sun had baked straight through that partition of glass bottles. The air pockets sealed between the glass and the masonry had heated up just like a baker's oven. Those dense, dark stones had greedily soaked up every ounce of that solar energy. Now, while the outside world was perishing at 40 below zero Fahrenheit, the rocks were slowly bleeding that energy back out. It was just basic physics. Thermal mass. The entire wall operated like a massive battery, discharging its power at a crawling pace. The young man pressed his palm flat against one of the volcanic boulders. It felt incredibly warm. It was exactly like resting a hand on the side of a breathing stallion, fresh off a long run. There wasn't a single freezing draft inside, since the cabin was dug straight into the dirt, shielded by the hill itself. The screaming gales merely swept right over the top, grazing the sod and straw roof without hitting any vertical surface to smash against. Mateo kept a tiny campfire going, just a handful of sagebrush embers to heat up his coffee and pinto beans. He didn't require a roaring inferno in the hearth. The dugout did the heavy lifting for him. He took a sip of the scalding brew, listening to the howling gusts outside, muffled by 3 feet of packed earth. His mind drifted to his old man. He recalled the tales of the elders who built with adobe and fieldstone, not out of poverty, but out of profound wisdom. "Thank you, Papa," he whispered into the cozy silence of his shelter. By the 3rd sunrise, the blizzard finally took a breather. The storm hadn't passed, but the roaring winds dialed back their fury for a few hours, leaving behind a desolate, snow-blind, lunar landscape. Down at the Thorne estate, the supply of broken furniture had run dry. They had incinerated the dining room chairs. They had tossed library books into the grate. Now they were eyeing the grand piano with desperate hunger. Over at Bill's cabin, the youngest boy wouldn't wake up. He was drawing breath, but it was dangerously shallow. The foreman, sporting bloodshot eyes and hands covered in severe frostbite, finally made a call. He glanced at his wife, who was frantically rubbing the child's icy feet. "I'm heading out to find help," Bill announced. "Where?" She wept. "Town is 6 miles away. You'll freeze to death on the trail." "I ain't hiking to town," Bill replied, staring through the frosted glass up toward the northern ridge. "I'm going to go check on that Mexican kid." "The rock boy? He's got to be dead by now, Bill. It's just a mud shack. If we're freezing in here, he's got to be a solid block of ice." "Maybe so," the big man muttered. "Or maybe not. I don't spot any smoke rising from his chimney, but I don't see his roof caved in either." The foreman bundled up in every scrap of fabric he could find and pushed out the door. Almost simultaneously, inside the Grand Manor, Silas Thorne arrived at the exact same humiliating realization. His boiler was utterly dead. His residence was an icebox. If they stayed put for another night, they were all going to perish. Thorne wrapped his little girl in a hallway runner rug and stepped out into the waist-deep drifts. Fate, or perhaps some twisted divine irony, caused the two men, the financier and the ranch hand, to cross paths right at the base of Mateo's property. They stared at one another. All that previous arrogance had vanished from their gazes. There was only sheer terror left. Their facial hair was weighed down by icicles. Their lips were turning a sickly shade of blue. "Are you going up there to loot the dead?" Thorne asked, his voice shaking, assuming the foreman was after leftover rations. "I'm going up to see if he's still breathing," Bill shot back. "My boy is dying, Thorne. I desperately need a fire." "That kid doesn't have any fire going," Thorne pointed out, gesturing toward Mateo's stovepipe, which was only venting an invisible shimmer of heat rather than the thick black soot of burning logs or coal. "Look at it. Zero smoke. He froze solid days ago. Then I'll just take his dugout for myself. A dirt hole is a hell of a lot better than my place right about now." They began their brutal ascent. The powder reached all the way up to their waists. Every single stride was pure agony. The gales were already starting to pick back up, signaling that the brief truce was over and the blizzard's second wave was rolling in to finish the job. They finally reached the entrance. It was a hideous door, cobbled together from mismatched planks and reinforced with scraps of weathered leather. The hammer raised his fist to knock. He fully expected dead silence. He figured he'd have to kick the frame in and discover a stiff corpse lying on a cot. But right before his knuckles even rapped against the timber, the door swung wide open. Mateo stood right there in the threshold. The sight hit both of those grown men like a physical blow to the gut. The teenager wasn't wearing a heavy coat. He was standing there in his shirt sleeves, and just past his shoulder, beyond him, there wasn't any freezing gloom. There wasn't any damp chill. The wealthy banker felt the breeze spilling out of the dugout. It wasn't the suffocating bone-dry draft of a coal furnace. It certainly wasn't the eye-watering, smoky draft of unseasoned firewood. It was a gentle, heavy kind of warmth, deeply toasty. It felt exactly like cracking open the door to a commercial bakery oven on a crisp winter morning. Bill, the hammer, instantly dropped to his knees in the snowdrift. His gaze shifted past the kid and locked onto that barrier of dark boulders humming in the background, bathed in the amber glow of a kerosene lantern. "How in the world?" Bill stammered in shock. "How is there heat in here? You ain't got logs. You ain't got any coal." Mateo looked down at the two fellas who had openly mocked him back at the general store. The very same men who claimed his property was nothing but a graveyard. He easily could have slammed the heavy timber right in their faces. He could have told them to drag themselves back to their frozen palaces and freeze alongside their fortunes. But the boy remembered his old man's calloused, giving hands. He remembered that being poor was never a valid excuse for acting cruel. "The sunshine doesn't cost a dime, gentlemen," the teenager stated calmly. "And these rocks don't charge any interest rates." The banker, a guy who owned half the county, felt hot tears freezing solid against his cheeks. "My little girl. She's freezing to death down there." "Go fetch them," Mateo offered. "Every last one of them. We've got plenty of floor space, and these stones have enough warmth to last a good while." What followed was a grim parade of utter defeat mixed with miraculous salvation. The wealthy patriarchs dragged their loved ones up that steep incline. They stepped into the same shack they had previously branded a tomb and a rat hole. And the second they crossed that threshold, once they felt the heat radiating off that ugly dark partition built out of volcanic debris and scavenged bottles, They grasped a profound lesson that no fancy East Coast business college could ever teach. They slumped down onto the packed dirt floor. Bill's wife broke down sobbing the moment a healthy flush returned to her little boy's face. The banker's daughter stopped her violent shivering within mere minutes. Not a single soul spoke a word. They simply stared at the masonry. Those silent, unassuming, dark boulders which had been resting on that hillside for millions of years before Thorne ever showed up with his banknotes, and which would remain right there for millions more. Mateo poured them out some weak coffee in battered tin cups. Silas gripped his mug with both hands, not just to swallow the brew, but to absorb the heat radiating through the metal. He glanced over at the teenager, who was relaxing quietly in a corner, whittling away at a scrap of timber. "I openly mocked you," Thorne whispered. His voice sounded incredibly small inside the cozy dugout. "I swore you'd be dead before Christmas." The kid glanced up, harboring absolutely zero resentment, yet carrying the heavy weight of truth in his dark eyes. "You put all your faith in whatever you could buy, Mr. Thorne. I put my faith in the things I actually understood. A man doesn't fight the winter. He simply outlasts it." The burly foreman reached out and tapped the glass partition. It was toasty. "This stuff? All of this is just garbage? Empty whiskey jugs?" "Trapped air," Mateo explained. "The finest insulation on God's green earth. The Almighty provides it free of charge. You just gotta figure out how to box it up." That evening, as the whiteout raged outside with fresh violence, trying in vain to breach the walls, 11 souls slept peacefully on the dirt floor of that dugout. The wealthy financier snored comfortably right next to the orphaned kid. The tough ranch hand dozed off, leaning right up against the mud mortar. The strict social pecking order of the Wyoming territory completely melted away. Cash held zero value inside those walls. The only currency that mattered was warmth. And the sole proprietor of that warmth was the very teenager nobody had bothered to treat with an ounce of respect. The blizzard dragged on for another 48 hours. When the daylight finally broke through, shining with blinding intensity over a pale, snow-covered world, the survivors finally emerged from the shelter. The surrounding scenery was absolutely devastating. Hundreds of frozen cattle dotted the plains, looking like dark boulders scattered across the white powder. Over at the manor, Thorne's pipes were blown to pieces, and his fancy decor had been reduced to ashes. The foreman's cabin had a large chunk of its roof ripped clean off. Yet the kid's dugout remained perfectly intact. That dark thermal battery was already drinking in the initial rays of morning sunshine, recharging itself for the upcoming dusk, completely unbothered by the disaster all around. The banker marched up to the young man. He reached deep into his trousers and yanked out a thick wad of damp greenbacks. An absolute fortune. "Take it," Thorne insisted. "Consider it rent or payment for keeping us breathing." The teenager stared down at the cash. Then he cast his gaze out over the ruined valley. "I have no use for your cash, Mr. Thorne. Spend it on some better panes of glass. Windows that face the southern sky, not the northern wind." Thorne slowly lowered his fist, deeply ashamed. The message landed loud and clear. A man can't simply purchase dignity. You either possess it or you don't. Bill the Hammer stepped forward next, and instead of offering up cash, he held out his massive, calloused right hand. "Show me how," the foreman requested. "I refuse to ever go through a freeze like that again. Teach me how to stack up a wall like yours." And right there, standing in the blinding snowdrifts of 1887, a genuine transformation took root. The spring thaw of 1887 exposed a massive graveyard. Once the powder finally melted away, the Wyoming territory looked like a valley of bones. The livestock belonging to the wealthy cattle barons, those beasts that represented ultimate power and status, were lying dead by the thousands down in the gullies. The great die-up had completely snapped the spine of the overly proud cattle industry. Silas watched 60% of his herd wipe out. The foreman ended up losing his steady job when the neighboring spread filed for bankruptcy that same spring. But as for the young homesteader, Mateo didn't lose a single thing. Simply because a fellow who owns next to nothing doesn't harbor any fear of loss, and a man who truly comprehends the soil is never actually isolated. Bill hiked back up that ridge about a week later. He didn't ride up on his tall horse, and he left his riding crop behind. He carried nothing but a crumpled notepad and a thick carpenter's pencil. "Show me," he asked once more. And this time around, the plea came straight from his core. The kid didn't hoard his knowledge. He didn't try to patent his thermal battery or demand a cut of the profits. He simply squatted down in the springtime mud alongside the big man and broke down the basic physics of solar energy. He laid out how a homestead needs to face the south, tracking light like a sunflower. He explained how glass snags the heat, how heavy masonry banks it, and how the packed earth keeps out the chill. The burly ex-foreman listened intently, jotting down notes like a youngster sitting in a schoolhouse. By midsummer, an unusual building project kicked off down in the flats. The hammer, a fellow who used to swear strictly by raw muscle, started raising his brand-new cabin. He refused to use unseasoned lumber. Instead, he gathered up river rock and mixed adobe clay. He pointed his glass panes squarely to the south. He constructed a trombe wall, an absolute mirror image of the teenager's blueprint. The nearby ranchers poked fun at him initially. "Looks like Bill went and turned Mexican on us." They joked down at the local saloon. Yet when the snows rolled back in the following season, and those brutal gales started howling once again, the foreman's cabin stayed incredibly cozy. His boys didn't hack up a lung. His woodpile stretched twice as long as normal. Those jeers quickly faded into dead silence. And eventually that silence turned into widespread imitation. The haughty financier never openly confessed his blunder to the town. Vanity is a tough sickness to shake off. Still, later that year, he fully remodeled his estate. He boarded up those massive northern-facing Victorian panes and constructed a south-facing sunroom, fully paved with dark slate tile. He proudly bragged that it was the absolute latest trend sweeping through Europe. But every soul in the county knew the honest truth. They were well aware that the brilliant concept had been born inside a $4 dirt shack. As the decades drifted by, the architectural landscape of the territory subtly transformed, all thanks to that kid. Newer barns were built much lower to the ground, hunkering down against the brutal winds. Freshly framed cabins began incorporating thick, solid barriers on their northern ends and heavy glass facing the south. The design of pure hubris eventually surrendered to the design of common sense and humility. The homesteader never amassed a fortune in greenbacks. He didn't establish a financial empire. He didn't buy up thousands of acres of grazing land. However, he struck it rich in a currency that paper bills can never purchase: genuine respect. He eventually hitched a woman from the local Shoshone tribe, a partner who firmly agreed that the soil was sacred. They raised 5 healthy children, and he made darn sure to teach every single one of them how to read the weather patterns long before they learned how to read a banker's ledger. He resided up on that exact same ridge for another half-century. He certainly expanded his dugout. He tacked on extra bedrooms, a wide front porch, and a wind-shielded garden patch where he managed to grow ripe tomatoes, even while the snow was flying. Just another little miracle provided by his solar battery. But he stubbornly refused to alter the beating heart of his homestead. That original partition of dark boulders and scavenged glass bottles stayed right where it was, completely untouched, radiating warmth every single evening, remaining as fiercely loyal as a trusty hound. As the homesteader entered his twilight years, his hair turned as bone-white as the blizzards he knew so well. His complexion weathered down to look like beaten leather. He turned into a bit of a local folk hero, Settlers would ride in from neighboring counties just to pick his brain about where to break ground, which way to point their stables, and how to properly read the shifting gales. Nobody referred to him as that Mexican kid anymore. They respectfully addressed him as Don Mateo. And hearing that title of Don roll off the tongues of the very gringos who used to spit at his feet felt like a triumph far sweeter than any kind of revenge. He passed away in 1938 at the age of 69. He slipped away peacefully in his own bed, right in the dead of winter. It was roughly 4 below 0 Fahrenheit outside. Yet securely indoors, inside his bedroom, the mercury hovered at a comfortable 65 degrees. He died surrounded by warmth. He passed on in total peace, comforted by the lingering heat radiating from the exact same rocks he had hauled up from the riverbank with his own teenage hands. The camera metaphorically pulls back, final and conclusive tone. Tales exactly like Mateo's serve as a stark reminder of an inconvenient truth for our modern society. We currently inhabit an era defined by smart thermostats, prefabricated housing, and high-end gadgets that constantly promise absolute mastery over Mother Nature. We falsely assume that if our bank accounts are fat enough, we can simply ignore the basic laws of physics. But the freezing chill is always lingering right outside the door. This narrative proves that genuine brilliance isn't found in complicated setups. It's firmly rooted in absolute simplicity. It demonstrates that one fellow's garbage, discarded jugs, worthless dark rocks, can become another man's ultimate salvation, provided he possesses the wisdom to recognize its true potential. Most importantly, it teaches us that stubborn pride is the absolute worst form of insulation on earth. Silas Thorne possessed all the cash in the county, yet he turned into an icicle. The hammer possessed all the brute strength a guy could ask for, yet the elements broke him in half. Only the orphan teenager, the kid armed with nothing but sharp observation and deep humility, managed to truly thrive. Our grandfathers understood this concept perfectly well. They erected their shelters working with the soil, not battling against it. They recognized that the goal isn't to declare war on the blizzard, but rather to politely invite the sunshine indoors. If this chronicle of quiet frontier justice managed to strike a chord deep inside you, if you are equally exhausted by supposed experts claiming that it can't be done simply because you lack deep pockets, if you catch a glimpse of your own parents or grandparents in Mateo's story, folks who pulled off absolute miracles using nothing more than bare hands and sharp wits, then you've absolutely found your community right here. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button on this video so the algorithm finally understands that we value genuine, hard-earned wisdom way more than empty modern noise. We are actively rescuing these forgotten sagas one by one, dragging them out of the dusty archives where time tried to bury them, simply because the modern world desperately needs to remember that, every once in a while, the ultimate solution doesn't lie in building taller. It lies in looking much deeper. I am Austral Legacy, and I'll catch you all in the very next tale of extreme survival. May your hearths always burn toasty, and may your spirits always remain humble.